Greetings, Software Defined Access, Hands-on, Chapter 11. In this chapter, we're covering the main topic of Cisco SDA or Software Defined Access, which is the LAN automation. We're covering the main concept of how does the LAN automation works in details. We go through the main points that need to be prepared prior to the LAN automation, where they reserve the IP address and where we modify the routing for the BGP and ISIS and to be visible to the Fusion router and to the DNA center. Once we've done that, we go through the LAN automation tools inside the DNA center so we can dive in and we do the LAN auto for the switch itself. After the successful, then we explore the config that's been pushed to the DNA from the DNA center to the edge switch. As we discussed it before in the previous video series with the software defined access overview, we mentioned that the LAN automation is one of the big topic or the main tool for the DNA center, where you send the switch shipped across to your customer, and you don't need a professional service or senior engineer or architect or designer to configure the switch for you. All you need to do is unpack the switch, rack it, stack it, power it up, connect it to the fabric or to the network, and let DNA Center configure everything for you. So all days we use the notepad or Excel sheet to configure, write the code, and then copy and paste it into the switch. This is not the case anymore. DNA Center will do everything for us. Now, understanding the concept is one of the main components of any successful deployment. And for that, I would split the LAN automation process into three main parts. Part number one is the preparation. Part number two, establishing IP connectivity between shared service and the edge switch based on temporary IP address for the point-to-point. Part number three is building the underlay base with the full ISIS based on permanent IP address, as you can see in the diagram. So let's go in details on of these parts. So part number one for the preparation. Now, the main goal, as we discussed, the main goal is the shared service or the DNA center can reach the loopback address of the edge switch, then it can push the config. Now, in order for the DNA center to reach that loopback address, which is not being created yet, and we will create it later on, that specific subnet, which is the point-to-point, which include point-to-point IP address as well as the loopback address, need to be visible to the Fusion router and in return need to be visible to the shared service where the DNA center reside. Number two, the ISIS and the BGP, they need to communicate so they can carry that specific subnet. As a preparation, what we need to do, we need to aggregate that subnet, which include the IP address of the point-to-point as well as the loopback address on the border. Then in return, the Fusion router will have visibility for that specific subnet via the BGP. In order to do that, we need to do redistribution across between ISIS and BGP, and this is what we're going to do as well inside the controller plane and border. Once we've done that, then shared service or DNA center will have visibility on that subnet which hasn't been created yet. Up to this point, this is what I called point number one or step one, which is the preparation for the underlay for the LAN automation. Step number two, we connect the edge switch to the border via interface number two on each side. And by default, when you connect two switches together without any configuration based on auto negotiation, that will establish layer 2 between these two switches. In return, what we do, we create a specific subnet for the LAN auto and we reserve it for the LAN automation inside the DNA center. What DNA center do, it create a DHCP scope based on that specific subnet inside the controller plane and border. And because we have a layer 2, DNA center will configure that specific interface as a DHCP, and in return DNA center will take the specific subnet, which is /24 or any other subnet that we created, and will reserve it will slice it into a smaller subnet by allocating /30 to the point-to-point with a temporary IP address .1 to the border and .2 to the edge switch, as well as permanent IP address to the loopback address of the edge. Once that IP address has been assigned and established, and based on the redistribution and the aggregate of that subnet, DNA center or the shared service or the SVI inside the fusion router will have full reachability to the loopback address of the edge switch. And up to this point, this is the checkpoint of our step number 2. Step number 3. As now we have a connectivity between the DNA center to the loopback address, what DNA center will do, it will delete the temporary IP address, which is for the point-to-point, which is .1 and .2, and will assign a permanent IP address from the same big subnet, slice it into a smaller subnet, and keeping the original loopback address. Once we reach that, it will push the config for the ISIS between the border and the edge switch based on these two IP addresses. So let's go back again and start the process again one more time. As we said, LAN automation based on 3 steps. Step number 1 is the preparation for the layer 3. In order for the DNA center, which is inside the shared service, to reach the IP address of the loopback address of the edge switch, which hasn't been configured, we need to make sure, as a preparation, we need to make sure that specific subnet, which include the point-to-point and the loopback address, has a visibility inside the fusion router. And for that, we need to do the aggregation for that specific subnet inside the control plane and border. And then we need to do the redistribution between ISIS into the BGP. And in return, fusion router and shared service will have full visibility for the loopback address and for the point-to-point between border and control plane. Once that's done, we do the checkpoint for the preparation and we're done with that. Then we go to the second point where the DNA center start pushing the IP address. And for that, let me just choose maybe another color. Now, step number 2, DNA center, as per preparation, has a full reachability to the loopback address. DNA center, based on the subnet that we created inside the DNA center for the LAN automation, it will create a DHCP scope inside the control plane and border, and it will split that specific subnet, even though it's a /24 or 23 or 20, regardless. It will split that big subnet and will allocate /30 with a temporary IP address to the point-to-point between border and edge, and a permanent loopback address to the edge switch. And this is our checkpoint for step number 2. Step number 3, once DNA center have full reachability to the loopback address, it will tear down the temporary IP address .1 and .2 from that specific subnet, which is /30. It will assign another /30 to the same interface with a different subnet, and will give it 65, or the first IP address of the /30 to the border, and second IP address to the edge switch, and keeping the permanent IP address for the loopback address. Based on these 2 new IP address, it will build the ISIS. And as we had the ISIS redistribution across, and as we have the aggregate subnet into the border, so that switch will be configured by the DNA center itself. Okay, and for that, let's dive into the DNA center and let's go through that process. It will make more sense when we do it all together in the GUI.